There was a lot of guilt feeling about what had happened in these islands. And I think there was just a general wish to forget it all and to put the lid on it and pretend it never happened. The story of the occupation of the Channel Islands, to my mind, has never really been told.
An unforgettable experience in many, many ways. Lots and lots of hardships and unusual situations, an element of danger, but an unrepeatable era.
We saw these Germans coming down. They stopped at the town hall, and they went into the town hall, and that's the first time that, of course, the Jersey flag was taken down and the swastika was hauled up at the town hall.
The Channel Islands were the only British territories occupied by the Germans during the Second World War. Situated in the English Channel, close to the French Normandy and Brittany coasts, the islands have belonged to the British Crown for more than 900 years, as part of the dukedom of William the Conqueror. Virtually self-governing, Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney and Sark, as well as the smaller islands, retain a certain French air, although their way of life is undoubtedly British. Sought by some for their romantic charm, to the world at large, the islands are perhaps best known for their cattle. They are littered with fortifications built over the centuries to protect islanders from would-be predators. But none have left such a lasting mark as those of the German occupiers of just 50 years ago. That occupation confronted Channel Islanders with many of the dilemmas people on the mainland of Britain would have faced if Hitler's ambitions had succeeded. Whether to defy the enemy or simply to acquiesce in the hope that liberation would eventually come. How far, when the outcome of the war looked bleak, to cooperate or even collaborate. Before the war, as now, the islands were a popular holiday destination, with most tourists coming from the British mainland. They came not just by sea, but increasingly by air. Both Jersey and Guernsey boasted new airports, which put them within 2 hours flying time from London, and of course, only a matter of minutes from France. For the 90,000 or so inhabitants of the islands, the boisterous visitors may have been a bit of a bore, but then, as today, they did provide a major source of income. Farming was the other main earner, especially from the famous dairy cows with their rich Jersey and Guernsey milk and cream, loved by visitors and islanders alike. Potatoes and tomatoes, as well as early flowers, were fast becoming important exports, again, mainly to England. The declaration of war in September 1939 hardly dented the flow of tourists. But there was an undoubted irony about that last summer of freedom's traditional Jersey Battle of Flowers.
The idea of war actually hitting the island was just the furthest from the feeling of anybody.
It was summertime. One expected all the visitors. They were there in June. Plenty of visitors, thousands. But then when we heard that the Germans were sweeping across France and coming to Jersey, well, everybody packed up and left.
You could hear the sounds of war and see, by the searchlights over France, that things were getting close. Obviously, the French were blowing up whatever they wanted to destroy in the path of the Germans.
And then we began to have high-flying German aircraft overhead doing their reconnaissances because they were not sure what the defences of the Channel Islands were.
There was no real line given from the authorities here, and I remember the last couple of weeks before the occupation, people in their hundreds were just milling around the streets of town, sort of asking each other what was the best to do, and nobody having any answers.
When they were nearing Paris, the Home Office informed us that there was every likelihood that we'd be occupied, and therefore offered facilities for the evacuation of men of military age, women and children.
When people started to panic, queues up the parade right past the hospital, right down through town, queuing up to register to get on board these boats, because there was people spreading rumours that the Germans were going to load the place to bits.
And people drove down to the harbour and got out of their cars and said to anybody around, if you want the car, you can have it. Because all you did was merely, you were allowed one suitcase, and all you did was merely, slam your front door and walk out.
People at the animal shelter here were in tears. They were asked to put down so many animals. It was like a slaughterhouse.
A lot of islanders that did go, they were accused of running away like rats, There was a lot of resentment, yes, at the time. There was a lot of panic, of course. Abandoned homes, cattle roaming the lanes, unfed, unwatered, dogs left in cars. Many people that did go to England, they managed to get back again before the occupation, and they found their homes had been ransacked. So there was a lot of treachery on the island, I think.
Less than 30% of the islanders went in the end, though it was decided to evacuate Alderney completely.
My husband and I were quite determined that we wouldn't go. With a farm, you can't walk out and leave animals. But the next morning when the church bells rang and everybody was going, even the doctor I found was going. I thought, not nice to be left here with nobody. And so we decided we would have to go. My husband went out and let all the cattle loose because they were tethered.
The people were more concerned over leaving their animals. We'd left our door ajar so that the black cat, Mickey, could get in and out. And I take it that most of the other people there was no point in closing doors. We just walked out like that.
The war reached Jersey and Guernsey with a vengeance.
It was a beautiful summer's day when they came over. People were sunbathing on the beach. It was only when the machine guns opened up and the bombs dropped and one saw the Black Cross markings on the aircraft, one realised it was for real.
I was standing up and I could see these planes. There was 3 or 4. They were pretty high. Then they seemed to come down and we could hear this chatter and chatter, just like a sewing machine thing going, something like that. But somebody shouted out, they're firing. And so we scattered like mad.
There were a lot of fatal casualties when they were machine gunned and bombed. And the Germans said in their news that they'd bombed troop concentrations down at the harbour and a lot of armoured vehicles. In fact, these so-called armoured vehicles were horses and carts full of potatoes for export. There were no troops there at all.
It made quite a lot of people decide to go, and quite a lot went by the last boats. It shook the people very much indeed.
44 people were killed that June day of 1940. The Germans realised belatedly that the islands were undefended, although the British High Command had declared some time before, albeit without much ballyhoo, that they'd been demilitarised. But to make absolutely sure, the Germans insisted that white flags be displayed prominently, and only then announced their occupation.
Planes were skimming the tops of the houses, these big bombers and things. They seemed a terrifying thing to us. Just a few yards above the chimney tops, making sure that all the flags were out as required and that there was no resistance, obviously.
I said to my wife, they're coming this afternoon, we're going to the pictures. So I went to the Forum, which is now non-existent, and when we came out, the Germans were walking along the pavements.
Jersey was occupied on July the 1st. Guernsey had been taken the day before. Sark and Alderney's turn came a little later. The German newsreel cameramen made the most of this first venture onto British soil.
Mit der Besetzung der Kanalinseln Guernsey und Jersey haben deutsche Truppen zum ersten Male englischen Boden betreten. Die britische Besatzung ist geflohen oder gefangen genommen worden.
Pretty well immediately we saw the first Germans because they started going around the streets, usually singing. They used to sing these military songs and clicking their heels to officers and all that.
We were in a very good mood because we had just won the war against France.
Of all parts of Europe occupied by Germans, it was the best condition here on Jersey.
We were much impressed about Guernsey. It was like a beautiful garden. And the people were so friendly to us.
From the first day
I always said to my soldiers, now we are in a country where milk and honey are flowing.
And the behaviour of the Germans towards us, I must say, was pretty good. They gave us a lot of respect as policemen. And if we were in the town on duty and a German had come up to you and he'd salute.
Life had to go on. The buses still ran. We went back to school, the banks reopened, and the shops carried on as best as they could. They were well stocked, of course, but you had this business of the German soldiers going around St Helier, buying up everything in sight.
When they first arrived, restrictions were pretty obviously those which were intended to avoid any military uprising against their occupation. All weapons of every conceivable description had to be handed in. All radios were taken in, and people were not allowed to meet in large groups.
Proclamations started to be issued. At the foot of most of these proclamations was the warning that the maximum penalty would be death. In most cases that didn't happen, of course. People who offended generally faced a few weeks in the local prison, but there was always in the back of everyone's mind that they could get tough if they really wanted to.
One had a funny feeling in the pit of one's stomach to have actually seen the Germans in uniform on this island for the first time. Because as days went on, more and more arrived until at the peak there were 12 or 15,000 Germans in Jersey alone.
Und im Übrigen war das eine ganz besondere Erfahrung für uns alle, auf diese britischen Inseln zu kommen, die so vom ersten Anblick her noch so aussahen, wie das wohl im Frieden gewesen sein mag.
Wenn wir gedacht haben, an unsere Kameraden, die im Osten standen, in Russland, was die armen Kerls da mussten mitmachen, dagegen hatten wir Urlaub hier auf den Inseln, das war Holiday für uns.
Aber das Verhältnis zur Bevölkerung war absolut korrekt. Also wenn man Eingeborene auf der Straße traf, dann hieß es manchmal, "Morning, sir, nice weather of the day, isn't it? Yes, it is."
Am Anfang war ja eine Fraternisierung verboten und später, gut, ich habe Mädchen, also junge Frauen kennengelernt auf Büros oder auf den Dienststellen und als eine Fraternisierung erlaubt war, hat man sich einmal mit so Mädchen getroffen. Gut,
ich denke, fast jeder hat irgendeinen Bezug zu Mädchen, wenn er nicht verheiratet war oder sogar der auch. Das kam ganz drauf die Person an.
A young woman that my mother eventually met was put into prison because she refused the advances of an officer and smacked his face, and she ended up in prison. So, you know, and I was one of a number of people who had various sexual assaults made on them. I was aged about 11 at the time.
While the islanders were clearly overawed by the German might, many in London thought there should be more resistance. Only a few on the islands agreed.
We were such a small island, totally undefended, that it would have been folly to have done anything to upset the occupying forces at the early stages. And even if we had done anything, it would have been counted for next to nothing. So we just took it, I could describe it as a passive resistance.
If you blew up a bridge in France, you could be 50 miles away or 100 miles away in a short time. But where could you go in an island 9 by 5?
There was no chance for resistance because there were so many soldiers, up to 40,000.
Some people just acquiesced and led their own lives and let the Germans get on with it, that sort of attitude. That was probably the most general one. There were what came to be called jerry bags, young women who fraternised and probably slept with German soldiers and got themselves a terrible reputation for having done so. There was active informing going on. Some people, I doubt because they really supported the German occupation, but probably out of petty jealousy or whatever, informed on people who were acting against the Nazis. The authorities collaborated I don't think you can use any other word than that, by countersigning proclamations and so on. One of the first things that really got up my nose was the decree ordering the deportation of Jews. Now, we didn't have a large Jewish population, but there were a handful of Jewish people here. And to find a Nazi decree countersigned by the civilian authorities ordering their deportation to Germany really got me down.
The German newsreel cameramen were fascinated by British bobbies, some of whom seemed to cooperate in providing Hitler's propaganda machine with winning pictures. The authorities on the islands faced a dilemma: how far to go along with the Germans in the hope of perhaps softening their demands.
When they took the English people away, they were thinking of resigning, but they said they wanted to stay as a buffer between the people and the Germans. But I think it would have been better if the Germans would have had to do their own dirty work.
At first I wasn't very popular at all, but then the truth dawned on people that they'd much rather have me knock at their door than a couple of German officers in steel helmets and probably with revolvers in their holsters.
There was a good bit of collaboration. Some type of collaboration wasn't... These people weren't actually traitors, like some of our civil servants here. But they carried on, you know. The Germans said, you'll do this, you'll pass this law, and they just carried on. But they seemed to be keen to carry out the orders. The Germans are the masters, they said, and that's it.
If they had refused, they would have come as police to the islands.
Well, they stayed in office and countersigned all the various German proclamations. Their claim always, then and since, was that they shielded the population against even worse excesses. How true this is, of course, I'm in no position to tell, but it's the sort of argument that I would suspect. We must be relatively unique, I suppose, in Europe, that the same people were in high office in this island before the occupation, during the occupation, and after the liberation. This is true both of the governmental officials, of the owners and publishers of the local newspaper, and so all the way through.
As well as printing their own, the Germans immediately took charge of all the islands' newspapers, which were strictly censored, though some journalists found ways of getting round the restrictions. For instance, not all the mistakes in the German translations were corrected, which helped to indicate which stories had been vetted. In addition, clandestine news sheets were passed from house to house, at great risk to the distributors, who based them on listening to radio reports from London. Such listening was, of course, banned by the Germans. But the islanders were not alone in being starved of news. London was anxious to know what was happening, and from time to time sent in spies.
First mission was a success purely and simply through luck. There was nothing, they weren't prepared for this sort of thing. They asked me if I was prepared to come over, and I said yes, I was. They said, well, you'll have to go out and see the submarine king at Swiss Cottage to discuss with him where the submarine can drop you. And by the way, you're leaving Plymouth at 9 o'clock this evening. This was at 10 o'clock in the morning. And we haven't got a method of getting you in from the submarine to the island. Can you handle a canoe? So I said, yes, I could. And on the strength of that, they sent a porter off to Gamages to buy a canoe.
Such missions kept the Germans on their toes and made them strengthen their defences. It made them wary, too, of civilian access to the coast.
Beaches were immediately put out of bounds, as it were, and they were mined very considerably. You shouldn't forget that Hitler had wanted the Channel Islands to be made impregnable fortresses which could not be recaptured by the British as a significant part of the Atlantic Wall. And this island had, and Guernsey for that matter, by comparison with its size, probably bristled with more guns and weapons and mines and tank traps than any way you could think of along the whole of Europe, probably.
The Germans realised the outlying islands like Alderney and Sark were particularly vulnerable to commando raids and spying missions, and sent more and more troops to garrison them.
The first impression really was this is the end of the world. We didn't see a wilderness like Sark was, completely cut off, in other words. We were wondering what we was letting ourselves in for here.
Boredom and loneliness were problems for the German soldiers on the islands, many of whom came to suffer so-called island madness. Sark had only a few hundred inhabitants. Apart from those born in Britain, none had chosen to quit before the Germans arrived. The feudal ruler, the Dame of Sark, had discouraged evacuation, and as the Germans were soon to find out, her word was law.
We knew the Germans were coming, and we arranged to meet them in the drawing room. They were very respectful. I heard them wiping their feet on the doormat. They came in, and I said to my husband, oh, that's a sign of respect for the house. So we're all right, I think. They came and gave us massive orders. And when I replied in German, they seemed perfectly satisfied and said they were only going to leave 10 men. And we thought we were going to get off rather lightly. But after a while, more and more came, and all went fairly quietly until we had our first commando raid. And that upset everything. They thought we'd been in contact with them, and they tightened up everything. No going out anywhere. You had to be in at 5 o'clock every afternoon, and altogether life was made very difficult. And then after that, they put 13,500 mines down on the top of the island, so we couldn't get access to the sea anywhere. I learned to speak German quite a lot because I was on the Rhine for 2 years after the First War. And I must say my German was of a rather kitchen variety, but it was very fluent, it was a big vocabulary, and that served me in very, very good stead in the war.
Hitler poured more and more troops into the islands. Frustrated because he couldn't invade the British mainland, he became obsessed with the determination to hold them at all costs. They had little strategic value for either side, but their retention became a matter of prestige for the Führer, hypnotized by the fact that they were British soil. To have tried to wrest the islands from the Germans would have produced a bloodbath, though London did commission plans for their recapture. Hitler found other ways to vent his frustration.
September 1942, the Germans brought out this terrible order that all people not actually born here were to be deported to Germany.
It was a reprisal because when the British forces went in there and they interned them, and Hitler ordered that 10 British subjects for every one German interned were to be deported from the islands. He aimed at about 6,000 or 7,000 people, but eventually he finished up with less.
They came on a Wednesday and we were gone on the Thursday, as quick as that.
I well remember the day that the first batch left to go to Germany because they had to pass my office, which was near the harbour. And it was a sight to be seen. Many of the men, veterans of the First World War, came back wearing their war ribbons, red and white rosettes. Many people had come in from the countryside in horse-drawn wagons, to which rosettes and ribbons had been attached.
The people were turned back. And when some people got home that night, they found the houses stripped bare. Not by the Germans, but by, people in the same streets who bade the material farewell earlier on.
My people were deported to Germany. I had my mother and father and a brother and 2 sisters deported to Germany. And that was the last I saw of my mother. She never came back.
We didn't know where we were going at that time, of course. We could have been heading for a concentration camp or Lord knows what.
In fact, the place where most of the deportees were sent was far from being a concentration camp. Biberach in southern Germany had been an army barracks, and although Spartan, was at least administered fairly benevolently by the Wehrmacht, who were embarrassed by this whim of Hitler's. The food at first was poor, but after the British Foreign Office made a fuss, the International Red Cross intervened, and eventually the deportees fared better, by and large, than the islanders they'd left behind, who, as the occupation entered its 3rd year, were beginning to feel the pinch.
We had a flourishing black market here, and people, as in all occupied countries, in the countryside, lived better than those in the town.
There were quite a lot of well-moneyed people in the town area, and they were willing to pay anything, up to £100 for a bag of potatoes or a sack of wheat.
Our local paper, the Jersey Evening Post, which was run by the Germans, there were pages and pages of little adverts for what? And if you had a spare pair of shoes you thought you could, you didn't need, you put a little advert and said, pair of shoes size 3, in exchange for what? And you would wait for the reply, and hoping you would be lucky enough to say somebody would give you a bottle of gin or a pound of butter.
There were some Dutch barges that used to run for the Germans, and some of the Dutchmen on board, they used to smuggle brandy over. It was a smuggler's paradise over here in those days.
After the liberation, when the British government declared that it would honour and exchange the German occupation currency for real money, people took literally baskets of these occupation marks to the banks to get money for them. So, you know, people did make a lot of money, some people.